Hey everybody, Dave Costello here, founder and CEO of Jetpack Workflow and host of Growing Your Firm podcast. Today's guest is Dustin Hostetler. He is the pioneer and industry expert behind many of the firms that have been adopting Lean Six Sigma, project management, constraint management principles in their firm. He is the co-founder and visionary behind Transformity Solutions. Prior to that, he was the chief innovation officer at Boomer Consulting. In this interview, we're really going to unpack what constraint management means, how to think about process change and technology change in your firm. And we're going to get some examples and a glimpse at what the big firms, what the top firms are doing to drive process optimization from one of the leading industry consultants and thought leaders, Dustin. Dustin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I gave you a quick intro, but for folks not familiar with your work, can you unpack a little bit of what do you typically do? Do you actually do the work? Do you dive in? Do you work with teams? Do you work with partners? Size of firms, industries? Give us a little bit more of exactly what you do on a weekly basis.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I were to summarize what our sweet spot is, and what I do and what Transformity Solutions does is we help CPA firms with their process and technology optimization projects. That really is, there's several different services that relate to that, but to boil it down, it's process and technology optimization specifically for CPA firms and their processes, whether it's tax, audit, accounting services, anything back office like project management, billing, etc. That's what our specialty is, and we also get into some visioning and strategic planning work as well, either for firms or for niches and segments within the firms is another specialty area of ours. In terms of firm size, we really work with all size firms. I would say if there's an area that we do spend more time in, it's normally the top 100, 150 firms, the larger firms. We do get into small and mid-sized firms as well. But if you look back on an average year, it's probably more weighted towards the mid-size and larger firms.
Yeah. Well, and I know, for our audience, we have some folks that are partners or leaders in larger firms. We have a percentage of the audience that, it's them plus a few employees. But I do believe that constraint management principles can be applied across the board. But the first question I have for you is, what does that mean as it relates to the accounting firm and the services that they deliver?
So, it probably helps to start with a definition of constraints and constraint management. And the simple definition of what a constraint is within an organization, what a lot of people think of it as or refer to it as is it's where you have a bottleneck in the process. It's where the work is coming into that step or that level of the process, and it's not going through that level at the same rate as which it came in or which it will move through the process after that point. And so, I find it helpful when I talk about constraint management. You got to start with what is a constraint, and it's essentially a bottleneck. It's a lot of work is coming in, and it's getting backed up. That step, that level in the process just cannot process what the prior steps before it have been able to do.
And what are some of the common mistakes, as firms are wrapping their heads around, maybe they intuitively feel where the bottlenecks are, client onboarding or intake of information. I mean, for firms that might want to apply some of these just on their own, as they're thinking about this world, how can they start using this methodology to really see an impact to their tax returns or month-end closes or something like? What is the best way to diagnose? And then we can dig into the change management end of things.
So, speaking your language, and right up your alley with Jetpack here is use your workflow solution to help you identify, right? Where do we have work that gets backed up? Let's look at what's in queue. Let's look at what our average time at these different steps are in the process. And if we use a classic tax example, if our average days in prep is 4 days and our average days at the review step is 11 days, that is a possible indicator that our review steps in the process could be a constraint. And so that leads us that, the looking at our data, looking at our results of the process can lead us to where that constraint might be. And then from there, we can start diagnosing, well, what's causing it? Well, we've got 10 preparers and we've got 3 reviewers. Okay, so what do we need to do differently? There's a handful of different ways you can address constraints in the process. One way would be to triage work. A common thing we see done in some of the leading firms that truly understand process and constraint management is they create different processes and value streams based on the complexity of the work. So a more complex engagement may have a different route than a basic or moderate type engagement. Basic, moderate might be able to be done at a lower level, may not have as many, because it's lower risk, may not need as many levels of review in the process. And so if you just try to shove everything down one process, you might have some bottlenecks, right? But if you start to triage and break out and think about, where do you hear the word triage most often? What industry, or what when you hear the word triage, what comes to mind?
So I typically hear it in a hospital.
Yep, that's typically where where it's originated from, is the idea of triage. And if you think about it, if you're coming into a urgent care, an ER, or hospital, and you've got, you might have cut your finger and you might need a few stitches, versus someone that's coming in for a heart attack. They're going to triage those 2 patients, right? One might just go to a nurse to get stitched up. One is probably going to go see a senior physician or specialist to help with, if you're coming in there with a heart attack. And so they're triaging patients. That's where the term usually you hear that. And that's the same application that I just mentioned there, that you can look at the level, the risk and the complexity of the work, and perhaps have a different path, even though it's a it's a 1040 or it's a business tax return. They can still have a slightly different process and different level that works on them, that can help smooth out those bottlenecks.
Now, this isn't exactly what you had mentioned, but when I hear the word triage, I also think that there is a pool of work that can be done by multiple different people in a firm. And I know we're getting in the weeds here a little bit. Is that what you classically see when you work with the larger firms? Is somebody comes in and there's a group of people that can potentially triage the issue, and you look at capacity and assign it out? Or is it more common where somebody's kind of either next up to take on the next client, or they review who has worked with this client in the past and they get to triage the issue? Is it split? What do you see the most of?
It's split, and even it's split within the same firm, not just across firms as well, because there's some levels of that work that would benefit from having a pre-assignment and someone that's familiar with the client, familiar with the work for efficiency purposes and effectiveness purposes. There's other times where it may be that the project, the engagement may be basic enough that prior year history is not that big of a deal in terms of an efficiency impact. And so it may go into a pool, a POOL pool, that individuals will grab work from as they're ready to work on it, that are assigned to that pool or at the right level. It might be more of a basic entry level, that type of thing. But they're grabbing one off as they're ready for it.
Okay, got it. So it sounds like it's incredibly critical that when you lay out your service offering as a firm, you kind of list them as basic processing versus more advanced processing. And anytime it sounds like you're getting into multi-stakeholders or multi-touch environments, whether you're asking a lot from the client or a lot internally, you need to build out entirely different workflow, which could be triaged by open capacity, or it could be assigned to client. But you really need to treat each service as its own kind of process, which could be simple or complicated depending on the deliverable.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. So let's say I'm listening right now. I'm listening to you, Dustin, and you said something that really resonated. Yeah, review. You hit it. That's what we need to fix. I'm on board, but I have this challenge. I have the team, and the team's used to doing it a certain way. Now, you could add more capacity. You mentioned hiring people, but maybe you want to change the process. Maybe you want to add a tool like Jetpack or whatever. And once you find the bottleneck, how do you really drive change management in a way that doesn't, debilitate the process you want to have accomplished in the first place?
Yep. So once you identify, where the opportunity areas for improvement, and you explore different strategies of how, what can we do differently to improve, and test, vet those ideas, et cetera. When you feel like you've gotten to a good solution, and you've tested it, and you feel that, this is our optimal way forward, to to get buy-in is absolutely critical. As I often say, you can have a great process on paper, but if people aren't bought into it, it's not going to be worth very much. And if people aren't using it, you're not going to improve, right? And so buy-in is really at the heart of change management. And when you're going to implement change within an organization, within a department, within a segment, process, whatever it might be, we have found that answering two simple why questions goes a long way toward getting greater buy-in and optimizing buy-in out of the gate. The first why question is explaining to everybody, this is why we needed to change this part of the process. Think of that as a toll gate. You start with why we needed to change in the first place. And then this, assuming you pass through that toll gate with your team, the second why question that you address is, why will this change? Why will these changes be better than what we're currently doing? And so by just taking some time to be transparent, to train as you are implementing the changes in the new process, and just having conversation, having collaboration around those two why questions, we found that our clients have had tremendous success optimizing buy-in out of the gate. Is it going to be 100% perfect every time? No. I mean, we always, but human nature is we're all a little bit resistant when something changes, right? To different levels of resistant, but when something changes, we as human beings, we typically react emotionally before we react logically. And so that's something to remember as you're embarking on a change management initiative. People are going to react emotionally before they react logically. And so to help them get to that logic quicker, we have addressing those two why questions we found very helpful to do that.
I love it. Well, two things. One, it reminds me of an old New Yorker cartoon where there's a gentleman on a podium. He's in front of a crowd, and he goes, "Who wants change?" And the crowd all raises their hands, and then the next panel says, "Who wants the change?" Nobody raises their hand.
Yep.
So really illustrates your point. But I wanted to call out something you mentioned earlier, which you said, if you test it and it works, which I think is very critical when you're selling, I think, the change and the change management. And so let's say you've identified the bottleneck, you've identified a way to improve it. Walk us through examples or the appropriate way to test something, make sure it's validated before then doing a mass, change to the firm.
Yeah, this is where if you can, at least on a small scale, pilot a change, even if it's just a couple of people, or a small group that can test the idea, that can test the change, that can practice it and learn from it, you can make the solution better. Not only is it going to help make the solution better, but as you get to that point that we just discussed, when you are rolling out and collaborating on, this is the change we're making to the greater group that's part of that process, by being able to point to and say, hey, we've already piloted this idea with this group, or with these three people. This is what they discovered. This is the successes they had. And actually, from doing that, you typically find there's some additional tweaks we could make to what we thought during going into that pilot, that by going through a few reps, or doing a few projects or engagements through that new process, we learn how to make it even better. Share that, be transparent about that. You start getting people bought in as well to, okay, they've done it, it's working, it's gonna help us, and so that helps with buy-in as well.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about buy-in, it made me think of some of the cultural aspects that you're talking about too. If you're a firm owner, partner, or leader, this concept of testing things and learning might be a net new discipline in the firm, where you kind of see an issue And instead of making a big sweeping change, you say, let's test it, make sure it works. And frankly, that phrasing might scare a lot of firm owners. Oh my gosh, I'm going to test it. What if it doesn't work? What if it fails? Or the team, right? They want to do right by the client. They want to do a good job for their manager. And so this concept of test is really can be very intimidating. And so for a firm that doesn't have the culture to test things out, what have you found to be successful ways to communicate? We will be testing things. Some of it's going to work, some of it's not going to work, but it's going to help us be better. What have you found to be useful in that concept from a cultural mindset shift?
Yeah, a couple of things. One of them is every lean project we do, we start with ground rules for leadership and for our project team. And one of those ground rules is a core value around we're not going to be afraid to fail forward. And it's one of my favorite sayings in business is being willing to fail forward. And the way I describe that is we're going to take 5 steps ahead with this initiative. We may take a step or two back along the way, but we're still going to be 3 or 4 steps ahead of where we started. And so let's not be afraid of that 1 or 2 steps back and fail to take advantage of the 5 steps forward. So that's, just that mindset. And like I said, we normally set that as expectations up front that this is what we want everyone to be living by, is this core value of we're not going to be afraid to fail forward. So we found that to be helpful with that mindset and to get the leadership team on board. And then second, what's the worst thing that can happen with a potential change? You test it and it doesn't work as you thought. You can always go back to what you've done, right? So there's that helps to think through that from a leader standpoint. It helps them to kind of get over that hurdle of being afraid to take a risk. And so making changes, taking a risk, and so just pointing out that, hey, if it doesn't go as planned, what's the worst thing that can happen? Okay, we go back to what we were doing.
Well,
More,
so
we're going to win a whole lot more than we lose, but the few that we lose, the few changes that don't go as well as planned, we're still going to be ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Well, on the flip side, we also have a lot of listeners that are very entrepreneurial, whether they're running their own firm or they're a department head. And, on the flip side, sometimes the case where you see 17 bottlenecks and you see 17 ways to start testing them and 17 ways to change it. And you want to do them all at once. And, it wreaks its own havoc. And so what is your recommendation where you're in a high growth environment as an accounting firm, you see a lot of things breaking? How do you start to figure out how much improve it once? What is your perspective on just how many bottlenecks to work on a single time?
It's in that case, it's important to prioritize, and we would recommend the 5-step lean process improvement methodology: define, measure, analyze, improve, control. And define, measure, analyze is all about understanding the current state, identifying in your example those 17 areas that could be feel like bottlenecks or feel like there's major issues here. And then during that analysis step, you are getting to root cause and you are identifying in there what's the core issue here that we're trying to address. What is the main constraint that we're trying to address? We know we can't solve all 7. We might know we can't solve all 17 at once, but if we, as we analyze this, as we get to root cause, typically it becomes pretty obvious where the core issues are, and you can start prioritizing the improvements in those core issue areas. And so just following that, define the scope of the process we're looking at, measure and map out and understand the current state, analyze the current state for where the core opportunities for improvement are. The 4th step is improve. Now that you've prioritized, what can we change in those areas? Identify those improvement ideas. And then the 5th step, control, is what we've been talking about this whole time: the strategy to roll out, implement, and get buy-in to the changes.
Got it. Well, I know we've covered a lot of ground here today, and I want to give folks the opportunity to be able to reach out and connect with you. One of the final questions I have is, what are some common mistakes you've seen in this journey? We talked about a few of them already: expectation setting, taking on too many projects maybe at once. What are some other things that folks need to be aware of as they go into this journey, as either common footfalls when people are investing here, or just common blockers that show up if it's your first time going through this?
Um, Good question. So a couple of things that come to mind. One would be you want to be careful that when you make a change, you understand the impact upstream and downstream in the process of that change. And a common mistake we see in organizations is that in the past, they've made a change in one area and didn't consider the impact it's going to have later in the process or earlier in the process. So when you make a change, you do need to ask yourself, even though it's going to be positive here at this phase in the process, is it going to negatively impact us anywhere else? So just be thinking through that as you make a change, that it's not going to have a negative impact someplace else. That's one of the common process mistakes we see. Another one would be adding resources to our discussion about constraint, adding resources, tools, technology, automation in areas that are not the bottleneck and not focusing on the bottleneck. You're only going to get done it's fundamental to understand you're only going to get through a process what the constraint can get done in a given period of time. And so another common mistake we see organizations make is they invest additional resources, technology, people, whatever, before a bottleneck. And so they just make the bottleneck even worse because they haven't done anything to address. We can only get 3 projects through this bottleneck a week, and we've got 20. We can now go from 10 to 20 that come into the bottleneck. That didn't solve anything. That just made us be able to start work faster and for it to lag and delay. So
Yeah.
address your bottleneck first, and then you can look to add additional resources, technology, automation, et cetera, or focus on the bottleneck for those automation, technology, resource opportunities.
Yeah. Well, quick follow up is the downstream and upstream implications. Do you have an example, or can you think of a time at a high level of when somebody changed something at the lower level and it impacted a part of the process or part of the firm that they didn't fully anticipate it impacting?
Yes, well, a common one would be when firms are looking at their PVC request process or request list, whatever you want to call it, whether it's audit, tax, whatever. And a lot of times firms are looking at what's easiest for me instead of how are we making this easier for the client? Because if we aren't making it easier for the client, just because it's easier for you is not going to lead to more complete, efficient, timely data requests coming in from the client, and that's what you're trying to get at. And so that is probably the number one area that we see that firms don't take into consideration all of the customer requirements in their process, upstream, downstream, and in this case, it's the external customer, the client, that's impacted. So you could have something that you think is super efficient for you internally, but if the client is not using it and they find it clunky or it's not valuable to them or it's not making it easier for them, that's not helping your process at all.
And so is that a matter of not following kind of the 5 steps you had outlined before and thinking, well, it takes us so long to get an organizer together. It takes us so long to get this list out of here. Maybe if we had one button that mailed or sent an email, that went out, but then on the client's end, they're like, I'm scared of this email. I don't know what's going on, or I don't want a physical binder, or whatever it is. Every client maybe has their story, but if you don't factor them in, like, great, we're getting these things out faster than ever before, and we're getting less and less back in return. We're getting nowhere faster. It's essentially what happened.
Yeah, I mean, common mistake. They just jump to the solution, jump to the idea, the improve phase, and they forgot to do their homework. They forgot to, understand the current state and analyze it and realize that the core issue that we're having in the process is that we're starting work with incomplete information in, and or we're very compressed because we get everything last minute. So to improve that, just because you made your process super efficient, if you didn't help the client in what they need to get you, that's not solving those two core issues that Analyze would have uncovered.
Yeah. Well, Dustin, this has been a real treat. I hope everybody really starts to think of their firm and think about the constraints they're seeing and follow the process that you had outlined. But I know there's so much more we can go into. I know you have a lot of content around the internet. What is the best way for somebody listening to reach out to you, learn more, or even just engage with some of your content?
Yeah, I mean, they can look me up on LinkedIn. My profile will be out there on LinkedIn, or go to our website at transformityinc.com.
Great. And if you're listening right now and you couldn't write down the two questions, we was talking about the tool gate of leading change management, or the 5 steps he talked about in the lean process, we're going to link everything up at jetpackworkflow.com/blog. That's jetpackworkflow.com/blog. We'll link up to your website. We'll link up to your URL. And if you're listening to this and you enjoyed it, leave a 5-star review. And if you really enjoyed it, share with a fellow firm owner who might be experiencing a lot of bottlenecks. They're unsure what to do. They're unsure of the process. They're new to this world. Share this content with them. That would mean the world to myself, and I know it would mean the world to Dustin as well. Dustin, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, David.